The first sign came not as a shock, but as a quiet recognition, an ache beneath Hope's ribs that would not subside, a trembling certainty that her body carried the memory of something unspoken. For days she tried to deny it, blaming exhaustion, the relentless pressure of her career, or the emotional whiplash that came with loving a man like Thomas while still haunted by the ghost of Liam. Yet the truth, when it arrived, came with the clarity of dawn breaking over storm clouds. She was pregnant. The test lay trembling in her hands, a small strip of plastic that held the power to change everything, her relationships, her identity, even her place within the unforgiving world of the Forrestos and Spencers. In the days that followed, Hope lived in a state of suspended reality. Every sound seemed amplified, every glance heavy with meaning. She remembered the night with Thomas, his hands, his promises, the quiet conviction in his eyes that their love could withstand the scrutiny of a world still doubting him. But she also remembered the night with Liam, the slip back into the familiar warmth of something broken but not yet gone. That night had been born from weakness, from nostalgia, from the desperate need to feel safe in the arms of the man who had once been her everything. And as if fate were not cruel enough, whispers still lingered about Carter, a rumor that had never been disproven, that still found its way into hushed conversations and boardroom gossip. Hope's reflection became her enemy. She would stand before the mirror and trace the faint curve of her stomach, imagining futures that contradicted one another. In one, Thomas stood beside her, redeemed at last, the proud father of her child. In another, Liam returned, a hero of domestic stability, reclaiming the family they once were. And in a darker vision, she saw herself alone, carrying not love but consequence. The uncertainty gnawed at her, eroding her peace with every heartbeat. When Brooke discovered the truth, she did not see a daughter in crisis. She saw an opportunity. For Brooke, the child represented a way to reclaim moral order, to sever the thread binding Hope to Thomas once and for all. Her arguments came cloaked in concern but reeked of strategy. She spoke of protection, of family legacy, of what's best for the baby. But beneath the surface lay the same ambition that had driven every Forrester, Logan Moore. Brooke wanted control, not healing. She wanted to prove that she had been right all along, that Thomas was a risk, a delusion, a stain on the family name. Her every glance toward Hope was a mix of maternal worry and political calculation, as though the womb of her daughter had become a battlefield. Ridge saw something else entirely. To him, Hope's pregnancy was a stabilizing force, a way to bind the volatile factions of Forrester Creations. He imagined headlines, family unity, a future where scandal could be spun into redemption. Ridge's pragmatic vision reduced Hope's private turmoil into a chess piece in the ongoing game of legacy management. He wanted balance between the Logans and the Forresters, and this child, depending on who the father was, could tip the scales. Ridge's calm exterior masked a ruthless clarity. In the world they lived in, love and loyalty were currencies, and this baby might be the most valuable asset of all. Then there was Taylor, gentler, more introspective, yet not without agenda. She saw in the pregnancy a test of truth. For years she had defended Thomas, insisting that he was no longer the manipulative man the world believed him to be. The baby, to her, was more than a child. It was a symbol, a living proof of Thomas's transformation. If Hope's child was his, then perhaps the world could finally forgive him. Perhaps even Brooke would have to admit defeat. Taylor's compassion for Hope was real, but beneath it pulsed a mother's longing to see her son rise untainted. Meanwhile, the rumor mill spun with merciless precision. Forrester Creations buzzed with speculation, designers whispering in corridors, interns exchanging gossip disguised as concern. Every detail of Hope's personal life became a matter of public debate: who she had been seen with when she had left the office, who had driven her home. The tabloids resurrected old scandals, painting her as a woman torn between love and recklessness, ambition and desire. Even those who cared for her found themselves asking the question she most feared: who is the father? As the weeks passed, Hope began to feel the weight of every gaze. Each person seemed to hold a different version of her story, and each version threatened to consume her. Thomas, sensing her distance, became both tender and defensive, desperate to assure her that what they shared was real. He spoke of commitment, of building a future, of naming the child together. Yet beneath his calm surface, old insecurities stirred. He knew the shadows of his past could easily return, that any suggestion of manipulation could destroy the fragile trust he had built. Liam, on the other hand, responded with a mixture of denial and hope. He clung to the possibility that the baby was his, not out of selfishness, but out of the lingering conviction that his connection to Hope was something destiny refused to sever. He told himself he loved her, that this child could be their second chance, but deep inside he feared he loved only the version of her that had once belonged to him. When he saw Thomas and Hope together, his composure cracked. To Liam, Thomas was still the same man who once exploited Hope's vulnerability, and the thought that she might carry his child felt like betrayal reborn. And then there was Carter, calm, principled, but now quietly implicated in a rumor he neither confirmed nor denied. His closeness to Hope during her recent stress had sparked speculation, and his silence only fueled the fire. Some claimed he was protecting her. Others believed he had something to hide. Even Brooke, in her desperation to steer the narrative, whispered that Carter's loyalty might not be entirely professional. It was against this backdrop of mistrust and moral warfare that the idea of a paternity test emerged. At first, it seemed simple, a scientific solution to an emotional labyrinth. But in the world of Forrester creations, truth was never pure. The test results became the object of manipulation, a secret currency passing between hands unseen. Somewhere along the way, perhaps in a lab, perhaps in an office late at night, the results were altered. A single switch, a quiet signature, and suddenly, fact became fiction. When the results were announced, the town divided instantly. Half believed Thomas was the father, citing the timing, the passion, the inevitability of their bond. The other half insisted it was Liam, pointing to history, to loyalty, to the moral logic of restoration. The press devoured every angle, and online debates turned vicious. Strangers picked sides as though choosing between saints and sinners. And through it all, Hope watched the spectacle unfold like a woman trapped behind glass, able to see her life torn apart but powerless to stop it. Brooke moved swiftly, using the supposed results to drive a wedge between Hope and Thomas. She orchestrated family meetings, tearful interventions, even public statements disguised as support. Ridge tried to keep peace, spinning the situation as a new era of transparency for Forrester Creations. Taylor defended Thomas with quiet fury, accusing Brooke of manipulating the narrative once again. Liam pleaded with Hope in private, promising stability, a home, a chance to rewrite their story. And Thomas, heart torn open, oscillated between despair and determination, between believing he had been betrayed and believing that love could still redeem him. But as the weeks passed, cracks began to show. Inconsistencies appeared in the lab records. A technician resigned without warning. A sealed envelope arrived at Hope's doorstep, containing 2 DNA reports, one marked original, the other final. The names did not match. Someone had interfered. Someone had decided who the father should be, regardless of truth. The revelation sent shockwaves through everyone involved. The betrayal was no longer just about love. It was about power, manipulation, and the fragility of trust in a world built on appearances. Hope, once the moral compass of her family, now found herself at the center of a scandal that blurred every line between innocence and deceit. She realized that her life had become the very thing she had once despised, a story rewritten by others, a brand controlled by those who claimed to love her. As the storm intensified, the question shifted from who was the father to who had the most to gain. Brooke had motives, moral supremacy, family control. Ridge had business reasons, legacy protection. Taylor had emotional investment, a mother's faith in her son. Even Liam and Thomas, in their desperation, could have tampered with fate, each convincing himself that his version of the truth was justified. Hope, caught in the eye of it all, began to see that the child inside her was more than a life. It was a mirror reflecting the corruption of everyone around her. Whether born of love or mistake, this baby would carry the weight of secrets too heavy for an innocent soul. In sleepless nights, she found herself whispering apologies to the life she carried, unsure which sin she was atoning for. In the end, the truth, whatever it was, seemed almost irrelevant. The damage was done. The Forresters and Logans had once again torn each other apart in the name of family, leaving Hope standing alone in the ruins of her own heart. The paternity test might someday be corrected, but the emotional fracture would remain. What began as a moment of human weakness had evolved into a war over identity, power, and perception. A reminder that in their world, love was never simple, and truth was never pure. As Hope stood on the balcony overlooking Los Angeles, the city lights shimmered below her like stars drowning in fog. She placed a hand over her stomach and felt a quiet flutter, a heartbeat, fragile yet certain. For the first time in weeks, she smiled, not because she had found clarity, but because she finally understood that this child, whoever its father might be, was hers alone. In that realization, amid the chaos of love and legacy, Hope found something she had long forgotten: her own strength. The battle around her would continue: Brooke plotting, Ridge negotiating, Taylor defending, Thomas yearning, Liam pleading, but for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace. The wind brushed against her hair, carrying with it the faint echo of what her name had always promised: hope, reborn from the ashes of doubt. It began as an almost poetic coincidence, the kind of symmetry that made people whisper about fate. Two women, bound by blood and rivalry, both discovering that life had begun to grow inside them at the same moment. For Hope, the revelation came with trembling hands and silent disbelief, the result of weeks of exhaustion and quiet confusion. For Steffy, it came like a promise, unexpected but perfectly timed, an affirmation of stability after months of chaos. Yet what might have been a cause for joy quickly twisted into something darker. By the end of the week, Forrester Creations was no longer a fashion empire. It was a family on the brink of implosion, a stage where unborn children were turned into symbols, leverage, and weapons. Hope's pregnancy had already stirred whispers through the halls of the company. The question of the father, Thomas, Liam, or someone else, hung in the air like a storm cloud. Every assistant, every designer, every board member speculated about what it could mean for the family dynamic, for the brand, for the fragile balance of power. But when Steffy's news broke, everything shifted. The coincidence was too perfect, too suspicious, too easily interpreted as a sign. Suddenly, the boardroom became a battlefield of loyalties, and the media began crafting headlines before the ink on the test results had even dried. 2 heirs to Forrester. 1 article read. 2 mothers. 1 legacy. At first, Steffy tried to brush off the tension. She had Finn, and she believed in their family. Their marriage, though bruised by Sheila's constant shadow, had endured worse. This child would be her anchor, a reminder that love could still survive amid deceit and ambition. But Steffy underestimated how hungry the people around her were for significance. Ridge, ever the patriarch, saw symbolism everywhere. 2 grandchildren meant 2 potential heirs, 2 continuations of his legacy, 2 mirrors of the women he had loved and lost in equal measure. To him, Hope's pregnancy represented redemption for Thomas, a chance to finally prove that he had changed, that his love for Hope was genuine, that he could be more than the sum of his mistakes. But Steffy's pregnancy carried something else entirely: stability. It was the marriage that worked, the family that endured, the image Forrester Creations needed in a world obsessed with optics. Brooke saw it differently. To her, the symmetry was an insult. Forrester's legacy, she believed, should flow through Hope, not Steffy. Brooke's pride was bound to the Logan name, to every triumph wrestled from the Forresters through charm and defiance. She refused to let her daughter be overshadowed by Steffy again. The idea that Ridge's empire might one day be led by Steffy's child instead of Hope's filled her with quiet rage. She began attending meetings she had long avoided, offering unsolicited advice on brand direction and family image, her words wrapped in concern but sharpened with calculation. Meanwhile, the company's board began to fracture. There were those who supported Hope, arguing that her designs and her social influence represented the modern, compassionate future of Forrester Creations. They saw her pregnancy as an emotional comeback story, a narrative of strength and forgiveness that could rebrand the family name after the scandals surrounding Luna's death and the ethical fallout that followed. Then there were those who rallied behind Steffi, the steady, loyal executive, the face of discipline and control, the woman who had held the company together during crisis. To them, Steffi's child with Finn was the true continuation of the Forrester spirit: unity, elegance, order. But beneath the polite smiles and champagne toasts, a darker tension festered. The boardroom became a theater of silent daggers. Conversations about fashion lines and marketing strategies became veiled arguments about lineage and power. Words like stability, family values, and legacy were thrown around with increasing venom, each carrying unspoken implications. Hope's supporters accused Steffi of manipulating her pregnancy to secure dominance. Steffi's allies painted Hope as reckless, impulsive, and morally fragile. And through it all, Ridge, torn between his two daughters, his two worlds, tried to play the peacemaker, only to realize that his silence was its own form of betrayal. Finn found himself caught in the crossfire. On paper, he was the model husband, the ideal father-to-be, calm, rational, devoted. But the truth was far more complicated. At the hospital, Finn had access to information no one else knew: medical records, test results, and files that linked Luna's mysterious death to a series of questionable decisions by hospital administrators and a shadow network of investors tied to Sheila Carter. He had tried to bury the knowledge, convincing himself it was safer that way. But now, with both Steffi and Hope pregnant, that secret began to feel like a live wire in his chest. It started with a whisper from a nurse he trusted, a quiet warning that the hospital's board was preparing to cover up a scandal involving falsified research, missing medications, and Sheila's old contacts in the pharmaceutical supply chain. Finn knew what it meant. The same system that had protected Sheila for years was still alive. And some of those investors? They had ties to Forrester Creations. The realization shook him. The company he thought of as family might be built on the same corruption that had nearly destroyed his own life. Every night, Finn watched Steffi sleep, torn between two impossible choices: protect her peace, or tell the truth and risk destroying everything. He had sworn to protect their family, but what if protection meant complicity? What if silence made him no better than the men who had once used Sheila's crimes to secure power? The moral burden grew heavier with each heartbeat, until even the sound of the ocean outside their Malibu home felt accusatory. As the pregnancies progressed, so did the manipulation. The press began drawing parallels, comparing every outfit, every quote, every public appearance. Hope, glowing in soft pastels, was labeled the dreamer. Steffi, sharp and composed, was the strategist. The narrative wrote itself: two women, two futures, two definitions of what it meant to be a Forrester. The media loved it, but the cost was staggering. Hope and Steffi, once rivals but occasionally allies, found themselves weaponized against each other by forces beyond their control. Every gesture was dissected, every smile questioned. Inside the company, a new kind of Cold War began. Marketing directors aligned with one camp or the other, investors whispered about heritage continuity, and creative decisions were suddenly framed as moral choices. When Steffi proposed a new campaign celebrating Forrester unity, Hope countered with a line emphasizing individual strength. The public loved both, but behind the scenes, the divide deepened. Even Eric, frail but watchful, saw what was happening and warned Ridge that the family was repeating its worst history, using love as a weapon and children as pawns. The turning point came when an anonymous email circulated among the shareholders claiming that one of the paternity tests, either Hope's or Steffi's, had been tampered with. There was no proof, only accusation, but it was enough to reignite old paranoia. Brooke blamed Steffy's camp. Taylor blamed Brooke's influence. Ridge tried to suppress the story, but the damage was done. The board began demanding clarity, not out of compassion, but because investors needed to know whose child they were grooming for the next generation of leadership. Hope was devastated. What should have been the most intimate part of her life was now a corporate talking point. Meanwhile, Finn grew increasingly haunted by what he knew. His silence became unbearable when he discovered that one of the hospital's falsified research projects had been funded by a subsidiary that supplied materials to Forrester's sustainable fashion division. It wasn't just a scandal, it was a direct link between Luna's mysterious death and Forrester's empire. He tried to convince himself that revealing the truth would help cleanse the company, that it might even bring peace to Luna's memory. But he also knew what exposure would mean for Steffy: lawsuits, reputation collapse, and the possibility that their child would be born into disgrace. Hope, unaware of the full scope of Finn's burden, began to feel the edges of her sanity fray. Her pregnancy, already shadowed by confusion over paternity, now felt like a curse. Everywhere she turned, someone wanted a piece of her child. Brooke wanted redemption, Ridge wanted legacy, Thomas wanted love, and the press wanted blood. Even Carter, quietly supportive from the sidelines, began receiving anonymous threats warning him to stay away from the future. Hope couldn't tell whether it was paranoia or prophecy. Steffy, too, began to unravel. For all her composure, she could feel the isolation closing in. Finn's emotional distance frightened her. His late nights at the hospital, his distracted silences, the way he sometimes looked at her with a mixture of guilt and devotion, it all added up to something she couldn't name. When she confronted him, he swore it was work. But Steffy knew better. She had inherited her father's instinct for lies and her mother's capacity for denial. By the time winter came, the rivalry between the two pregnancies had transcended gossip. It had become mythology. Supporters of Steffy and Hope turned the unborn children into emblems of destiny. Fan blogs debated which child would inherit Forrester's soul. Stock prices fluctuated based on photos of the two women. The company began selling limited edition lines inspired by New Beginnings, and behind the marketing glitz, the real war grew quieter, sharper, more personal. Then came the leak. A journalist published a partial medical report hinting that Finn had suppressed evidence linking the hospital to Luna's death and, by extension, to Forrester Creations. Panic erupted. Ridge demanded answers. Brooke accused Taylor of orchestrating the story to distract from the paternity scandal. Taylor fired back that Brooke was willing to sacrifice Steffy's peace to protect Hope's image. For the first time in years, the Forresters faced not just a family scandal, but the potential collapse of everything they had built. Finn finally broke. Standing before a room of flashing cameras, he confessed that he had known about the hospital corruption for months, that he had stayed silent out of fear for his family. He spoke of Luna, of the system that had failed her, of the moral rot that connected the hospital's deceit to the fashion empire's greed. His confession detonated like a bomb. Forrester Creations' shares plummeted overnight. The public, once enamored with the brand's glossy perfection, turned on them. In the aftermath, the family splintered completely. Hope retreated into isolation, her health fragile, but her resolve hardening. She refused to allow her child to become anyone's pawn. Steffy stood by Finn, her faith shaken but unbroken, determined to rebuild what truth had destroyed. Ridge, faced with the ruin of his legacy, finally understood the cost of turning family into strategy. Brooke and Taylor, exhausted by years of rivalry, found themselves standing in the same room for the first time without hatred, only sorrow. And so, the story came full circle. Two women carrying life. Two men caught in webs of guilt and loyalty. Two unborn children destined to inherit a world their parents had already poisoned. Yet, amid the ruins, there was something fragile, almost sacred, the possibility of renewal. Hope and Steffy, once adversaries, began exchanging messages, small gestures of peace. In the stillness of night, both could feel their babies moving, hearts beating in tandem, unaware of the wars waged in their names. Forrester Creations would rebuild, as it always had, but nothing would ever be the same. The brand that once stood for beauty now bore the mark of truth, imperfect, painful, but real. And in that truth lay the quiet irony of the Forrestons' world, that even as they fought over legacy, power, and bloodlines, the future they feared most was already forming, quietly, within them. Two hearts, two beginnings, untouched by ambition, waiting to be born into the chaos their parents had created.